History is often written by the victor, and therefore little is known about Spartacus before he led a slave revolt that plagued the Roman Empire for more than 2 years. It was not the first or the last revolt, but it was one of the longest slave revolts in Roman history. Although many historians say the revolt was doomed from the start, it did give the Romans a much-needed wake-up call, and the gladiators were treated better after the uprising. Spartacus hailed from the land of Thrace, a land in southeast Europe near Greece. Spartacus had great physical power. He was a man with outstanding military abilities and was very intelligent and clever. He was a leader with definite ideals and social programs. Spartacus believed in equality, and many slaves and free people joined his cause. Some of the details are not well known, and it is difficult to separate fact from fiction because of a lack of contemporaneous recorded history about Spartacus before and even during the slave revolt. However, it is believed that Spartacus fought in the Roman army, deserted, was captured, and sold into slavery. He then became a gladiator. Gladiators held the lowest status. They were slaves who were prisoners of war or who had done something wrong, and whose chances of dying in the near future were very high. Gladiatorial games were where people and animals were slaughtered for entertainment. Spartacus was sent to Eleusis in Capua, where he fought and trained with other gladiators. Some historians say Spartacus convinced his fellow gladiators to escape, while others believe Spartacus, Crixus, and Oenomaus were chosen to be the leaders once they were safely away from Capua. However, it was at Eleusis, owned by Lentulus Batiatus, in the city of Capua, where the slave revolt started. In 73 BCE, about 200 gladiators planned to escape. However, they were betrayed. Only 78 gladiators who armed themselves with kitchen utensils were able to escape. Once the slaves were outside the Eleusis, they found a wagon filled with gladiatorial weaponry and seized it. They traveled south to Mount Vesuvius. Spartacus had influence over the Thracian contingency, and Crixus was the leader of the Gallic and Germanic men. The gladiators escaped from their masters, formed an army, and took up arms against them. Rome took the slave revolt seriously and immediately sent Praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber and 3,000 men to squash the revolt. Spartacus and his men were camped on a ridge on Mount Vesuvius, and the Romans were camped at the bottom of the mountain. There was one narrow path down off the ridge, and the Romans had guarded it. The Romans thought that when the gladiators ran out of food and water, they would be forced to come down the mountain. However, the gladiators had other plans. Spartacus and his men cut and wove the wild vines to make ladders. They climbed safely down the mountain. They took the Roman army by complete surprise. Spartacus and his men attacked suddenly, and many of the Romans were killed or ran away. The victorious rebels seized the Roman camp and all of its supplies. Daring and ingenuity were two main characteristics of Spartacus's revolt. They won with brain power, not the power of their numbers. However, after this battle, their numbers began to grow. The praetor Publius Varinius and his subordinates Furius and Cosinius did not fare any better against Spartacus. Not many of the specifics are known about these battles, except that they were disasters for the Romans, and that Spartacus captured more camps and took more of the enemy's supplies. Spartacus shared the spoils and profits from the battles and raiding equally. His reputation and cause was growing. Spartacus became a figure of fame and fear. More and more slaves joined Spartacus and the revolt. Spartacus and his army were now at a whole different level. One historian said, "Because of the fear and the danger of the situation, the Senate dispatched both consuls together to the war, much as they would send consuls to a regular war of the greatest difficulty and magnitude." The two consuls for 72 BCE were Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus. They were sent out with 2 legions, which is 9,600 men. Accounts vary, but at this point, it is believed that Spartacus's army numbered 70,000. The fact that Spartacus could feed and arm this many people is impressive in and of itself. It is not known why, but at this point, after the victory over Verinius, Spartacus headed north. Crixus, along with 30,000 men, were defeated at the Garganus Mountains by Gellius Publicola. 2/3 of this group, including Crixus, were slaughtered by Publicola. In the meantime, Cornelius Lentulus surrounded Spartacus and his army as they headed north. Spartacus defeated Cornelius Lentulus and once again took their supplies. Eventually, Spartacus beats both consular armies. One reason why Spartacus and his army survived as long as they did was because the Italians were happy to allow Rome's enemy passage in their territory. The rebels left Capua and headed southward, moved across the peninsula to the east coast, then turned all the way to the Alps. Their journey covered more than 300 miles, and with the exception of the Roman defeat of Crixus, which Spartacus was not a part of, Spartacus overcame all the forces the Roman Empire sent to oppose him. It is quite remarkable how far the rebels traveled. The revolt was in its 3rd year when Marcus Licinius Crassus, a wealthy Roman noble, was asked to take over command. Crassus recruited 6 legions and took over the 2 consular legions already in the field. He had command over nearly 40,000 trained soldiers. At this time, Spartacus's army had traveled past Rome and was heading south. Crassus sent his legate, Mummius, with 2 legions to approach the rebels from the rear, with strict orders not to engage them. Mummius did not obey this order. He engaged Spartacus in battle, and he was defeated. The Romans incurred heavy losses, and even worse, many Romans dropped their weapons and retreated. To make sure this did not happen again, Crassus used a punishment called decimation. Decimation was the worst punishment a soldier could receive. 1 soldier out of every 10 was randomly selected to be clubbed to death by his peers. Crassus made sure his soldiers feared him more than they feared Spartacus. After this horrible punishment, the Roman army started to win some battles. Whether it was to raise support for the slave revolt or to create a diversion for the Romans, Spartacus planned to utilize the aid of Sicilian pirates to go to Sicily. The Sicilian pirates were usually ready to help the enemies of Rome, especially for pay. However, Spartacus was betrayed by them, and he and his army never made it to Sicily. Some accounts say the slave army was so desperate to get across the strait that they tried to use makeshift rafts and barrels lashed together. They failed to make it to Sicily, and now the Roman army was caving in on them. Crassus built fortifications of some sort across the toe of Italy to besiege the rebels. Spartacus and his army would be trapped. The accounts vary, but it is clear that Crassus's soldiers undertook an immense building project. One source described that the wall was 35 miles long, and the trench was 15 feet wide and deep. Thousands